We can't betray the Palestinians in Gaza yet again. We've been waiting for 8 months. Palestinians in Gaza have been losing their lives under Israeli airstrikes for the last 15 months. It would be so cruel to do this to the Palestinians in Gaza, but also Palestinians across the territory who have been on their toes and holding their breaths. So, of course, it raises concerns for us that there are disagreements on the details of the ceasefire at this point. While everybody, I've been on interviews talking about welcoming the ceasefire, and that these unresolved clauses, in the agreement are causing delays in the final approval. And as we've heard, yes, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu stated that his cabinet is not going to meet to approve to the ceasefire deal until Hamas backs down from what described a last-minute crisis, supposedly around the names of the arbitrarily detained prisoners, Palestinian prisoners. But let's be clear, the focus has to remain on saving Palestinian lives, but also the lives of the hostages and delivering aid. And civilians shouldn't be paying the price for political disputes. And that's what, Palestinians in Gaza have been paying a price for the last 15 months. Aid has to flow in freely, unconditionally, and immediately. And so it's really, this is a chance to bring real relief to Gaza, but it's not enough, of course, on its own. The blockade and the occupation also have to end for really any hope of a lasting peace.
Yes, initially though, when the news of the ceasefire began to ring through, what was the reaction in the West Bank where you are?
I mean, everybody, again, we're still living under Israeli military occupation. Let me be very, very clear. Our lives are affected. Every aspect of our life is affected by this brutal occupation. I'm unable to even reach my office in Jerusalem because of the checkpoints. So it's hard to rejoice completely because it hasn't been yet announced. Now we're seeing the backup, and we've been promised this before over and over again. And so nobody wants to get excited too quickly. But also, like I said, the ceasefire saves lives in the short term, but it's not enough for Palestinians. And it's far from a solution. It's merely just a pause in the war that has torn Gaza apart. We've got tens of thousands of Palestinians that have been killed. We've got entire communities that have been obliterated. We've got entire families that have been wiped out from the registry. And the very fabric of Gaza is completely shattered. And people have become bargaining chips in this whole ordeal. So again, we reiterate how and recognize the initial steps towards this, but these are just the beginning. True peace and justice really demand the end of the ongoing suffering and the Israeli occupation and blockade.
Of course, as you mentioned, this is a humanitarian crisis. Tens of thousands of civilians have been killed in this conflict. And on the other side, of course, there are the Israeli hostages. There's so much of trauma that many people who have gone through, families and friends of those who've lost their lives, and effectively impacting everyone that lives in Gaza and the West Bank. How do you think recovery efforts will be conducted to recover from this sort of trauma?
Well, the primary obstacle to recovery efforts is Israel's blockade. Of course, the bombs as well, but it's the blockade because it's the total control of Israel over Gaza's borders. And so Israel's destruction of key infrastructure, roads, hospitals, water systems, has made it nearly impossible for us to deliver aid at the scale needed. The restrictions on fuels, on permits, on visas, and the blockade on crossings prevents us from providing essential supplies. The situation inside Gaza is chaotic. There's no law and order. People have been displaced over and over and over again and crowded into unsanitary, camps that basically are a death sentence to Palestinians. So it's not just about, how many trucks come in and what medical supplies come in and can get through. It's about the systems and the infrastructure and the safe conditions that are required to allow aid agencies to operate effectively. And without a functioning and organized aid system, which Israel has completely fragmented and brought to its knees, we're left scrambling, trying to get the supplies in because we're facing a crisis of logistics, of coordination, of safety. So to meet the needs of Gaza's population, Israel has to lift its siege, open the borders, and stop blocking humanitarian aid.
So you're telling us that also the provisions of the ceasefire agreement don't provide for that?
Well, not in detail, absolutely not. Not enough in detail for us to understand. We've had to adapt our operations in the last 15 months to a point where we don't know what crossings are going to be open, how many trucks will be able to enter. Are we going to be able to enter humanitarian workers in? We've lost 1,000 health workers in the last year. That's enormous. We need teams in, we need doctors, we need nurses, we need humanitarian workers that will deliver the aid. All of this is not part of the ceasefire agreement, or the details are unknown. And so without all of these conditions in place, we'll still be facing almost a whole, population on the brink of starvation, and we'll continue to see more deaths and more catastrophe in Gaza with a completely dwindling, humanitarian situation.
Yes, and finally, do you see Israel giving any ground in the sense of the more settlements that are still being built in occupied Palestinian territories and in the West Bank as well?
Well, thank you for mentioning this. I think, we're terrified that, and a lot of people that I speak to here in the West Bank, everybody says our turn is next. So we've seen the escalation of settler violence against Palestinian communities, against Palestinian homes and agricultural lands over the last year, with the full protection of Israeli soldiers and police forces, and complete impunity. I mean, this is happening completely unchecked. These settlers are not being tried. They're not being charged for the crimes that they've committed against Palestinians, and they continue to encroach on Palestinian lands and continue to confiscate Palestinian lands. So watch the West Bank very carefully this year. If the ceasefire holds in Gaza, things are not expected to be bright for us here in the West Bank. Things have become far worse. The economic situation is at an absolute standstill. Businesses are closing because we can't reach one city to the other because of the checkpoints, and because of this full Israeli control. So we're terrified, really. I mean, so that's why this ceasefire comes with mix of emotions, because we still live under Israeli occupation that has been deemed unlawful by the highest court in the world last year, and asks for third states to dismantle the illegal occupation of Israel within a 12-month period. And we're not seeing any steps towards that. In fact, we're seeing, again, encroachment more on Palestinian land, more confiscation of Palestinian land, and more demolitions of Palestinian homes and Palestinian infrastructures.
Okay, Bushra Khalidi, really appreciate your time speaking with us. Thanks so much.
Thank you for having me.